Our next two presenters, two close friends of mine, longtime Synergites. One of our most senior developers, Gene Sewell. Gene's been with Synergis how long, Gene? 20-something years?
More than 20 years.
More than 20 years. One of the original or very early developers of Adept. And Eric Homeier, many of you know Eric. Eric, in addition to being an Adept implementation specialist or application consultant, may have done many of your implementations or upgrades over the years. Eric's also been an administrator at several Adept customers. So I'll turn it over to you guys for things every administrator should know.
So good morning, everyone. So me, as Scott had said, been in with the software for over 20 years. I kind of did the math yesterday. I'm about 23 years total with the software itself at one stage or another. And as he said, I've worked both as a customer at 3 different locations, and then an Adept administrator, and now with Synergis. Right?
So I don't remember how long, but it must be more than 23 since I helped port Adept to Windows at the very beginning. So I started at NFM 3. I've been a developer at Synergis for a long time. I had a long career before I came to Synergis, but I'm not going to say when it was I started, but a while ago. Okay.
So improving the quality of your database. So some of you have been in some of the classes at the beginning of the week, so you've probably heard some of the things we're about to go over. Some of it you may not have. One of the things that I always push and very strongly about is the database analysis report. The database analysis report gives you all of the fields that were built custom for you, and there's only one system field, and that's the file name, because it's the only field in the system that you can actually modify. And it gives you a report of its usage rate. It tells you, for example, the name, what the width of the characters were set to, what the current longest character string that's in there is now, and it gives you your usage rate. So for example, this one says the field is hardly used. You might consider removing it to speed up the system. Right? So in the sense of database quality, I always suggest that you do this 6 months, and then again a year, typically after you first start. How often you want to do it after that is kind of up to you. But it's really just getting used to what are you using, and it tells you a few things. It tells you, okay, we set up all these fields. When we first put in Adept, and we worked with Jeffrey or Nick or myself or someone, or Myra, one of the others, we wanted all of this. And our plans were that we were going to manage it. We were going to need this information, and we'll try to rein you in a little bit, but then we don't know sometimes either, right? So we put in everything, including the kitchen sink, and then later on you find out that you needed the kitchen sink, but you didn't need the sprayer, right? So it's really going in and saying, we don't really need the field. Nobody's ever used it. It's been 6 months down the road. It's completely empty. We don't need it. You can clean it out. The other thing that you may find is that you did that, and it's like, okay, we're looking at this going, okay, seriously? Console ID? That should be on every file we have. Why do we not have that field filled in? What's going on? Is it not extracting properly? Are we not filling it in? Do we need to start using required fields? If you recall, we mentioned yesterday, that's one of the ones that we find a lot of people don't use, but probably should. So why is the data not getting there? And then also, can we shrink it in order to minimize the database? Keep in mind that if you set a field to 72 characters and you're only using 10, the database is using 72 characters for every file, whether you're using it or not. Right?
Just a couple of other little points. I would think it's nice to have a data card that isn't huge and has, so many little edit boxes. So by seeing which fields are hardly used at all, you could also remove them from your data card and have a cleaner looking data card for your users. Another thought is if you're extracting data from title blocks, by looking at the percentage of fields that have data, you may discover that something's not right. Maybe your first version of title blocks was mapped correctly, but the new version isn't, or something like that. Okay.
The last thing I'll just add to it is there are 3 database analysis reports. There's the current database, the version database, and the history. You want to check all 3 before you start removing something or start changing something, because what you do affects all 3, right? So your longest character might be 15 in the history or the version, but only 10 in the current. If you reduce it down to 10 or 11, you're going to cut off those characters and the other ones as well. Right? Archiving audit trail. So one of the things we've learned in the last couple of days is there is a new feature. I'll point up here. Include archived audit trail events, right? So now it makes it even easier for you to archive. I know in the past, a lot of times, users didn't archive because they wanted everything to be available to all users. One of the things I find that is difficult is when I say, okay, we need to archive this off, and the user's like, but the administrator's like, well, we use that archive. Like, users need to be able to go in and see the history of a file, and when you archive, that history is no longer available to them, right? Well, now it can be, and now they can actually search and be able to pull up that history on a file. So it's beneficial to take that out of your current database, move it off to an archived database. It's still visible by the administrators as well as the users, right? Your upgrade time, for example, when you go to upgrade from 2017 to 2018, one of the points that makes that slower is the command table. The command table is your audit trail, right? So when you go to upgrade, it could be the difference between 45 minutes and 2 hours or even more, just by taking the command table and archiving that off.
Enough said.
So there's a report for DB counts. The DB counts report, I think, is often overlooked, but it's a good place to go, especially for administrators, to see just how much we are using inside the database. And you'll see over here, for example, there are 70,333 documents. The audit trail, 573,306 records, right? So again, you can get a pretty good feel for, here's your history, how many libraries, et cetera. It's just a place that you can go and get a list of what's going on and how much of it you're actually using and where the size in your database is, and kind of give you an idea of what you can clean up.
In this list of sizes, it's a little confusing, and I tried to give little hints, you know, like library sets, for example. It sounds like you'd say, we don't use any library sets, but the name gets used for other features, like every user has a list of what libraries he most recently used, and that is listed as a library set. So if something's confusing, you could put in a question to help desk, but it's definitely a useful report.
Truncating transaction logs. It's something that often, if you have a DBA internal that already takes care of your database, is probably already doing, but not everyone does. And the transaction log, I kind of think of it similar to our audit trail. It tracks everything and anything that gets done inside of SQL. So every time you do a search and it queries the database, that gets recorded in a transaction log, right? And one of the things I think a lot of people don't realize is SQL will suck up all of that data. It will take up everything available on that hard drive if possible, and it will keep building the transaction log until it runs out of space. So it is not uncommon for a customer to call and say that their Adept server's crashed and they can't get it started up because there's no space available to do so, right? So we do have a document if you, that Help Desk has available that will actually walk you through how to clear that transaction log and maintain it on a regular basis.
I've said.
Repair database through Designer. Then the Designer tool, if you stop the Adept server and go into the Designer, this tool allows you to basically run a repair. Now, back in the old days, and Gene and I are both from the NFM3 days, it was dbcomp was what it was called, but basically it goes back through the database and looks at your records, and it kind of re-indexes and compresses. So when I typically explain this, I think of it like defrag, when it used to go back through your hard drive and take all the data and crunch it all back up and get rid of all the dead space. To me, that's what this is doing. Gene might have a little bit different opinion, but that's how I describe it.
I think this, and there's another call inside the desktop app that will re-index the database also for parents and children. So all the glyphs match up. Parents have kids and kids have parents.
Cool. Purge history or turn off history. History is still one of those ones I like to point out to people because a lot of people don't understand how the history really works, right? So there's a fine line, I think, in my side of things on whether or not you track history or don't track history. If you're saving a large amount of revisions or versions, most people are saving 9,999 versions. I know some people might look at that and go, what? But that's what we do. A lot of people do, right? If you're saving a high level of versions, then history becomes less important. History tracks everything that changes on the data card. So that's every time you check it out, every time you make a change within your work area, every time you check it in, as well as any activity that happens to that data card that's in the system, including the approval processes that goes through and workflow. So every record of that card, every time it's copied, that's tracked in the history, right? And oftentimes, we don't need to save that history across the last couple of years of work, okay? So I find oftentimes you may need to track it in the last like maybe 5 or 10 times that card was changed, especially if you've given users the ability to change library cards on in documents, because now you're tracking those times they're changing while it's just been sitting in, right? For those who don't allow that, then really you only need the card that's changed for that version, which is already tracked. There is a data card for every current file and every version file, and then there's a card for every time it changes in the history, right? So I often find that people will have the history set to like 999. If you're saving like 3 or 4 version levels, then maybe you want to save a large amount of history because you don't really have ability to go back and see some of that information. But if you're saving a large version level, history becomes a little less important. And history can bloat the database because you're saving 999 times it's changed in the system. You might only have 10 versions, right?
I would say one way to tell is in your organization who searches the history table. If you never search the history table, then you don't need the history table. If it's a major part of your process, then you probably do. It does take up a lot of space. But on the other hand, it's tracking metadata, which in different organizations is more important sometimes than even the documents. But I agree. Normally, you don't need too many history records per document.
ALS lists. Right? So what are ALS links? Ugh, I'm getting it all mixed up. So every time you get an email notification via workflow, so the following files have been assigned to you or they have been approved and they're waiting for your approval, anytime those files get to you, those are ALS files, right? If you use the send to command and you choose to send them as an ALS link or an Adept link, that link that comes through is an ALS file, right? And then again, there's an option again in transmittals as well, where you can send a transmittal to someone internally, where they'll get the transmittal and then they'll have links to the files that are inside of Adept, right? So for example, you get that ALS file in your email, you double click it, it opens up Adept to the file or files that have either been assigned to you or sent to you, right? That ALS link stays in the system depending on how you have it set, right? So how do you manage them? So there is a inbox membership and troubleshootings. It's under the system tab for administrators. That allows you to go in and manage the ALS lists per user. So you can actually clear them globally or clear them per user. This will actually go in. It has several different options in there as well. So you can reset an inbox, delete column sets, delete searches, delete personal groups, library sets, delete ribbon sets, delete hidden lists, etc. So your hidden lists and your user ALS lists, right? So you can actually clear those out. There are a lot of people that use ALS lists, so I wouldn't necessarily just say go and delete them all, unless there's some issue with them or something like that, but I wouldn't go and clean them. You can manage them, especially if you want to clear a clean slate. There is also a report that gives you all the ALS lists. So there's a list report under the reports from the system tab, where you can actually see what ALS lists are being saved by who. So you may want to look at that as well and see.
This is an interesting dialogue. We internally call this the nuclear option. There's times when a user just has problems, so that's another reason to use this. There's a menu, pick inbox, troubleshooting, and membership. So in addition to ALS, you can help users who have other problems. Okay.
The typical one I see is when people can't get into their inbox, or there's an issue refreshing the inbox. I've used the reset inbox a few times.
Yeah.
But as Gene said, that's the nuclear option, right? So there's another one that's not quite so explosive. You can actually set it to a time frame, and you can say we're going to save ALS files for 30 days. After 30 days, it clears them out, right? And that's just a good management of the ALS. Again, there are some folks who use the ALS lists over a long period of time. They may put it in their SAP system, for example, or their ERP system so that they can double-click it and get to Adept. You would not want to clear those out, right? So there is a line on where you're going to look at and see how you use ALS and whether or not it's something you need to manage or not, right?
Question?
Do ALS lists always point to the latest version of the file, or do you plan for specific versions?
So currently, they float, as we call it, to the latest version. I did get a request. They'd like to have fixed ALS lists, which I've put down as a feature that we can consider.
Yeah, so good question, because if you save those ALS lists, for example, in an ERP or something like that, it's always going to bring you to the latest version of that file currently. It does not bring you to the file at the time the ALS was created. It's kind of the same as your favorites list.
That's correct.
So some changes in the Adept 2018 designer, kind of reiterating what's already been said before, right? So you can make file guide views, data card changes in designer now without locking out users of Adept. You just can't add, edit, or delete fields in designer. But you can take existing fields and add them to the data card, create new data cards, move fields around, and you can add and change file guide views. You just can't add, edit, or delete fields themselves.
And so you'd see this message box when you bring up designer. It looks and sees that the server's running, so it tells you the server's running, and if you press OK, you go into a limited functionality mode where you do not have the ability to edit, add, delete fields.
Some things on login speed. Reopen active window at login. There is a setting for all users. It is a user setting that they can set to say reopen active windows on login. Right? In general, that's not a problem. However, if their last window was their work area and they are not good at managing or keeping their work areas well managed, then they could potentially be logging in. And what happens is for someone who has a large amount of files in their work area, it has to resolve that work area before it logs you into the system. before it makes that final login where it starts to display the actual windows, it has to resolve your work areas first. So my first level of things I typically suggest that users who have those issues would first go clean up their work areas, especially for those who have unresolved work areas. There is a fine line, I think, between whether or not I have a lot of files in a work area or I just have a lot of work areas, right? There is a point when I can get to way too many work areas, and just because I'm trying to keep my work areas smaller. But then there's also, I have too few work areas with just lots and lots of files in them. One way or another, you're going to end up paying for that. But if you, it is definitely, I definitely advise that if you have a lot of files, kind of separate them out a little bit into some work areas just to help speed up that performance when you go to open your work area. So as we said, unresolved work areas with too many files, or too many work areas can be an issue.
I suppose I could add that in the desktop, there's this, at the bottom of the application, there's a little place where it says what your current work area is, and there's a work area chooser that you can click on. So rather than open the work area window, you can just change to a different work area. And that definitely saves time.
Especially if you know opening that work area is going to take a while to do normally,
Yes.
right? Because you could just pick it right from that list and not have to ever access the window. So when you go to check out a file, it'll check out to the work area you want it to go to.
Yes.
There is a new command in 2018, verify work areas on login. Right. That is an administrative change. It is global to the system, and it just says that we're not going to do that. You will technically pay for that one way or another. At some point when you open your work area, it's going to have to resolve. This just keeps it from resolving during the login. So I think it's 6 in one, half a dozen in the other, where you want the performance change to be.
Unless
you
you
say?
never go to your work area. And then
There you go.
You saved a lot of time.
Plugins. Right. So I talk about this a lot in some of my admin class. I talked about it in the beginning of the week too, in a couple of my classes. There's 32 plugins that are available in Adept currently. Right. Some of us are using a lot of them. Some of us are using a few of them. If you're not familiar with them, you may want to, just in case there's some in there that you're not aware of. But when it comes to plugins, that's when you go to log in. If anyone pays attention to the very right-hand bottom of your Adept screen, it tells you what it's doing during that login process. It'll tell you when it's updating the admin table. It'll tell you when it's loading plugins. We go through that entire list, and we check to see if you need it loaded or not. Right. So what I'll typically do is I'll move all my loaded to the top, just to get them loaded first initially. But then I'll also go in and typically suggest that we clear the ones that aren't being used off. Right? Just take the ones that are not loaded and take them out of the system, and you can do that by selecting the delete. It doesn't delete the plugin, it just deletes it from the list. Right? So if you decide you're, later on down the road, you decide, hey, we want to use the approval notification, right? The electronic approval. I could go ahead and add that later by simply going to add and then browsing to that file and adding it back. If you know you're going to use it, but you're just not using it currently, then maybe you don't want to remove it yet, right? But there's no need to necessarily go through all 32 during that login screen. Now, how much of a difference that makes? You know, it's not a huge improvement, but it's an improvement, and that on top of everything else, every little bit helps, right?
Enough said.
Local data cache. Local data cache is intended mostly for users who are in remote locations or other offices. You can configure local data cache, so what you do is you basically point a folder at a server at a remote location. So for example, if we're here and I have another office in San Diego and they're coming into the database, when I make an admin change, whether I go in and modify a permission or I go into the options and I change one of the settings in there and I say OK, everyone's seen that screen, or at least seen their users with that screen where they say, my Adept blanked out for a second and it came back again, right? That's updating the admin tables. From a remote location, that update may take longer. So local data cache actually puts the admin tables local to that server first, and then checks to see if the users are available to download that data cache, right? Rather than just globally pushing it out to everyone now and making them wait for that performance change and how long it might take to download.
I just add the at each site, the IP address of different workstations have a lot of commonality, and we use the IP address to determine if you are in or not in the data cache the admin set up. Also on the login report, there is a section at the end of each user which says whether or not they are in a local data cache. The local data cache caches the admin downloads, as Eric said, so it definitely saves time not only in login, but just during runtime. Okay.
Oh, someone made a reference in I think it was in one of my classes, where they said that it works the same as AFS, which is basically the same concept, right? We put in the IP address and the MAC address, and depending on where you are when you log in, if you're in that MAC or IP, that's how it identifies where you're at. So
Okay.
I hadn't thought about it that way until he said it. Performance. Auto update at document dashboard. Does anyone here deal with really large assemblies? Okay. If you do, if you notice when you go to select, I am one of those people that visually selects files every time I'm looking at them, even though they're all on the same screen. I have to pick it to see if that's the one I want. Every time you pick it, it loads the relationship browser, or the document dashboard, sorry, new terminology. It loads the document dashboard for the relationship tree and the information that's in there. Right? This setting basically disables that. You can still see the document dashboard, but now you have to load it on demand by selecting the right click on your file and saying load document dashboard.
And for what it's worth, if you have your document dashboard sort of hidden, there isn't any update clicking around. So unless you deal with huge assemblies, you can just have the document dashboard hidden and only bring it up when you need to see it, and you wouldn't need to use this option.
This came up, I believe, yesterday. There's a new command in 2018, display disabled users' work areas. I know there was a question that went around, how can I see the files that people have out? And as Gene mentioned yesterday, if you mark them as disabled, you can still get to their work areas. This feature does that for you. It actually displays all disabled users in their work areas, so you can easily start addressing those files right there.
Yeah, it's a very powerful feature. That was a common complaint that admins, that we got requests for some help with. If you have turnover in a company, what to do about files that you didn't realize were out, or something like that. If their work areas were on a network, you, as the admin, can still check the files back in because the work areas are on the network. And you can see all the work areas, you can see what files are there. Maybe you care about them, maybe you don't. You could even check in new files that were in a work area that were never checked in. So it's a very useful and powerful feature. Yeah.
On that feature, everything is mentioned as you can check it in. can you assign to a different user at that point as well?
As a part of checking it in, sure. This only works if the work area is on the network. If a user's machine is no longer online, then of course you can't get their files. But this lets you see their work areas, whether or not they're networked. And if they're not networked, you could release ownership, which basically abandons all the work. Did I answer your question about assign?
So, yeah.
Well, I'm still in 2015, so all the new terminology is a little fuzzy for me.
Understood.
So, because I look at check-in like I just checked it to an in status, but I don't want to do that. I want to say assign it to you because you're going to take over this user's projects.
So that'll be the case if it's a checked library, because then it can go into hold and assign to somebody. If you're an unchecked library, check-in really does mean in, right? So when I look at this, the report that you're going to get, or the list that you're going to get of all the work areas and the files that are there, if it's a network work area, as Gene said, you're going to need to administer that and share it to yourself in order for you to get access to it, I believe. I don't think this is giving you direct access to it, is it? Oh, it is. I was not aware of that.
Yes.
Sweet.
Yeah, it's as if it's your work area.
Okay. And then you're going to need to check the local machine. If that's on a C drive somewhere, you're going to want to get that folder local to you, or find it and get it. So that immediately tells you, hey, wait, before you get rid of that machine, IT, this guy's got some files in there and I need to go get them, right? So you need to do that. If you can't, and they've already been gotten rid of, that file is already gone, or that machine's already down or not accessible, you can at least release the checkout of that file.
Yes.
Or release ownership was what it used to be, right? And at least get that file back into where it was. However, any changes that were made, if you have to do that, they're still on whatever that box was. So you can get it back to its last state, right? And then by last state, it means if it was on hold and you checked it out, it's going to go back to hold. If it was in and they checked it out, it's going to go back to in. Right?
But it's what you have to do. Otherwise, nobody can work on that file.
Yeah, yeah. Sooner or later, someone's going to go get it or want to get it, and you're going to end up doing that again anyway, right? Indexing. Oh.
Is that right-click in the work area?
Yes, I apologize. The command isn't very visible, and I could tell some people hadn't known about the command. It's only available if you right-click while you're in the work area tree. You right-click on the work area tree, and you'll see that command. Maybe we'll add it to a ribbon at some point. It's only available to admins, which is the other reason people might not have seen that command.
Indexing fields. So indexing fields is a way to get faster searches on certain criteria. Anything that is in the file guide, or not file guide, the file guide. Anything that's in the file guide at the top level of the file guide is already indexed. So what I'll typically do is suggest that you go through there first, see what you want to create file guides for. Those are indexed. And then you can go into the Designer app, and you can actually mark things as indexed. You get up to 15 index fields. I like to think of index like, basically, I'm looking at an Excel sheet or the database like an Excel sheet. And when you do a search, we actually go to the first line and search across that line. So for example, if I'm looking for a project name, I go to the first line, look for that project name, second line, look for the project name, third line, look for the project name. But I'm not looking at project name, I'm scanning across for that value, right? The index field is kind of like saying I'm looking down and I'm going project names straight down the list, and I'm grabbing project names that match the value. So it's a faster search if you're using index fields, right? But to take use of the 15 fields, you can take advantage of those by making sure that your file guide, the top level is always indexed. So whatever the first value in your file guide is, that's already indexed, so you do not need to index that again, right? So then you can use 15 plus the 32 file guides that you have in order to get more index fields.
which is for faster searching.
Correct.
Right.
AFS vaults, it's really just talking about how to get files accessible to users faster. AFS has the ability to replicate files between sites. So if you currently have another site that is checking files out from your location, if you haven't already moved to AFS vaults, you may want to consider that as an option to replicate files to that site. That way, when they go to check out a file, they're not checking it out from here. So for example, saying I have Adept here and that site in San Diego I mentioned earlier, when someone in San Diego goes to check out a file, instead of checking it out from here, they're checking it out from the local server at a satellite site.
Enough said?
There is a performance suite that's added to 2018. I think the usage will probably be a little bit more on the side of help desk being able to help troubleshoot things with you, but also we suggested that you run it, for example, when you get back to your office on Monday, if you have 2018, it is located in the options window all the way below the admin options under troubleshooting. And there's this, oops, clicked the wrong one. There's this option for execute performance test. And basically what it does is it mimics checking in files into the system and checking them back out and gives you a report of the performance of that. And it's a good benchmark tool, first to just say, okay, what is our status now on doing that? But it's also really good for users who are saying they have slow issues, whether they're remote locations or at your location, and the ability to run it here and say, okay, well, this is what I'm seeing. Now let me go see what they're seeing and be able to compare and say, it's obviously taking longer for you to do this process than it is for me. My recommendation is always when you select, you have to select like 2 files that you're going to use. I always suggest you use basically an average file size for your users. So if your drawings, I would take 2 drawings out. I would also suggest that you use the same 2 drawings for that test at different locations, and they have to be files that are not already in Adept, right? Because it's going to check them in and check them out, and it's going to give you an error if you go to check them in because the files already exist, right? So typically, I would grab 2 files, put them on my machine, put them in a work area, define that in the performance test, say run. It'll run that process. Then I'll take those same 2 files, rename them, and put them on another person's machine, and run that same performance test and say, okay, what are we getting? And that's a good indicator that, okay, it's not necessarily, first of all, it's not Adept because I'm getting this. So what is it about your connection and the things going on your side that are making that take longer?
This is a very nice tool. It's something you could use as a benchmark. So when you first start running or when you get home on Monday, like you said, run the report, save the report as a benchmark. It gives you millisecond timing of how long all the most popular commands, including extraction, took. As Eric said, you can run this from problem work areas or test different kinds of libraries, FTP and direct. And then over time, if people start complaining that the performance isn't as good as it used to be, sometimes that's just subjective, and an objective test with millisecond timing will tell you exactly what's going on. And one of the reasons we did this was help desk used to ask you to do this series of tests, and when you did it with help desk, it would take hours selecting files, finding the dialog, hitting OK, going on to the next. This literally operates without any need for anything except the initial OK, and in minutes you can get a benchmark that definitely would take hours before. Yeah.
So I see that you identify a work area. Are you saying that it'll run the performance test on every file in that work area?
No, the idea is you don't have to pick 2. You pick some test files. Maybe they're for extraction tests. Maybe they're big assemblies. Maybe they're they're not so big. They're just doc files. And those are from a non-work area. They're the first step in this series of tests is to copy them into your work area, and then to check them in and check them out and check them in again now that you have to create versions. So it goes through the whole sequence of operations. And then when the test is complete, all the files are removed from Adept, so you could repeat the test over and over again without having to worry about duplicate files.
Can you do it from a work area where there's already files in there?
Sure, it's literally just like copying the files from Windows Explorer into that work area and then doing the tests.
What's the output?
The output is, assuming you have it is a text file that's got, all columnar data. It lists the individual tests for each. If you had 10 files in the test, for example, it would give you the timing for each of the 10 files. And then at the very end, it would give you summary conclusions of average times for each operation.
Cool.
Okay?
Glenda's all smiles. She approves.
Yeah, this feature really kind of was written for help desk, but also for you. It's an important issue. How do you quantify and improve performance? And this is designed for that.
There it goes. Delete all empty libraries. So there is the feature to identify. Everyone's probably familiar with that one. You could, in the past, you could identify the libraries. A few releases, we put in a delete all empty libraries. I think it was last release, 2017. I'm not positive, but the ability to delete. So when we first scan in, for example, over top of your existing structure, every folder comes in as a library. You can uncheck them, but a lot of times people don't. And check the ones that aren't actually going to be used as libraries. Those libraries take up space, or they kind of build upon your relationship table, your permission table that gets used by users, right? So it's good to go in and empty those out if they're not actually going to be libraries. Everyone's like, well, I need that. I hear that a lot. The customers are like, well, I need that. I'm like, but you don't actually plan to put anything in it, do you? Like the folder that says projects, and then underneath that are your projects, you're not actually going to put files in the project folder. You're going to put them in the project folder that is called, project ABC, right? So that folder at the top level isn't necessary to be a library. So those are the ones we want to go through and just kind of clean out. This goes in and actually goes and deletes all the ones that are not actual files in them and removes them, right? The folders that are at the bottom level get taken out. The folders that are in the mid-level, for example, will get converted to folders.
Yeah, I was going to clarify. We don't delete the folders. We definitely don't delete anything on the disk. We don't delete the folders that are at intermediate levels, but we do convert them to folders. And on the web client, converting things to folders will speed up the way the library browser works in the web client. Yes?
So if you do that, and I have a library which is empty, then I have a series of sub-libraries. We would convert that library into a folder.
Yes.
I have zero content in the library, but that's where I would find all my permissions.
You can, believe it or not, even though something's a folder in the UGLA, you can still assign permissions to the folder and have that be inherited to all the libraries underneath that folder. So it doesn't need to be a library to get permissions.
Okay. Just going to go over one last slide, and that is system reports receive a makeover. Right? So many reports now open up in Excel. So as long as you have Excel on the machine that you're running the report from, those are, for example, the admin daily brief, the audit trail, database counts, login, system, the user report, workflow. Those all open now in an Excel format. If you don't have Excel on that machine, then they open up in Notepad.
The report's still a text file, but we're just opening the text file from inside Excel.
To do that automatically, or is there an option to keep it as a...
Well, it's automagically. If first tries Excel, and if it can't find Excel, then it just uses Notepad.
Any other questions? Oh,
Kind of going back to the transaction log with SQL Server.
yes.
So does Adept make use of the transaction log data in native to SQL? And if not, is it okay to switch the recovery model to simple instead of full so you don't have that ever-growing transaction log?
That's best practice, yes.
Which feature is that? The delete or the reports? The reports are in 2018 as Excel. Yeah, that was a new feature in the 2018 release.
If you want to consolidate your libraries, what is the best method to move all those files from, a library you want to get rid of? What's the best process for that?
Really just move. Do a search for all the files that you want to move, and then right-click. You have to be an administrator, obviously, but right-click, move, and then choose your destination. You may get, if you have duplicate file names, I think one of the things I see a lot are we bring them all in at once, and then we clean up from there, right? So then we do the move, and sometimes you get some that get left behind. And that's a good way to find some of your duplicates as well. But yeah, the process, just make sure all your data is there, what you want on the card. And then I typically, if you're going to get to the point of going that level and it's actually moving a bunch of stuff upward and what we call truncating the database or truncating the libraries, I will typically pull out their path of where they are now and populate that either in a memo or create legacy fields, because I may want to go back to where those files came from at some point down the road. And someone goes, I used to be able to find it. It was here, 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 and here. I will typically create legacy fields for that so that we still have the original path of where it was before we cleaned it up.
I would just add that the files all have to be in. If you have files signed out or, yes. I believe.
Server, right? Because otherwise it's tying up my computer, moving them.
I would definitely do the move from the server. The move from local there's a lot of from the server to me back to the server, from the server me back to the server information is going back and forth. I would definitely move from the server. Yep.
All right, we've got to wrap up. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Gene and Eric. We'll do our